Hello, hello. Sorry for running a couple minutes late, guys. Hope y'all are doing well on this very cloudy Thursday. Let me get my video going, get some lights going. Hope you guys are doing well. Glad to see y'all. Thank you for being here. I don't really have that many announcements. Basically, everything we talked about last time still applies. The only thing is that, next week we're going to be doing a discussion on Thursday. And the discussion will largely be about the things we're going to be talking about today and on Tuesday. So today we're going to be talking about the market revolution, and on Tuesday we'll be talking about kind of the response to the market revolution, which is, I think, are both really fascinating topics. And so today we're going to be talking about this broad idea called the market revolution. And this lecture is a little bit different than the ones that we've done recently. Many of the lectures that we've done in the past couple of weeks have been very limited in terms of their chronology. They cover a very specific period of time, right? Like the Revolution, or George Washington's presidency, or the presidency of, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, or the War of 1812, right? A very finite, very small number of years. This lecture, on the other hand, is going to cover a much broader time frame. It's going to cover the market revolution roughly from 1800 to about 1850, and those dates are incredibly flexible, right? There's no beginning and ending of the market revolution. It's really something that takes place over the course of a number of years and affects every facet of American society. It is difficult to understate the importance of these years and kind of how it affected the development of this kind of like market economy, affected American society and culture, and not to mention, of course, the economy itself. So we're going to be talking about a revolution today, and it's not a revolution in the sense of like guns and arms and overthrowing a government, but more so a revolution in the way people lived and the way the economy worked and the way that people conceived of things like work and leisure time. So in order to understand why it's a revolution, we have to start at the beginning of what was going on before the revolution happened, right? That's where we got to start. So let's get going and talk about the world as it was. So we're going to start by talking about, where things sat before this market revolution. And if you're trying to think of like a time frame here, think about it roughly as like American Revolution era and maybe a little bit beyond, so like late 1700s. That's what we're talking about like right now when we talk about the world as it was. So what do we mean? How was the world in that era, in that late 18th century? So most people worked on farms. Most people lived in rural areas, and so when they lived on farms and lived in rural areas, the most common career was that of just a subsistence farmer. A subsistence means that you're farming for the survival of your family, right? To subsist means to survive on something. And so what most people did, the life that most people led, was a very simple life on their own farm with their family, maybe a small farming community around them, and they grew crops to survive. That was their life. That's all going to change over the course of this lecture. They're not selling their crops, at least most of their crops. Most of their crops they're using for their families. They're using, to survive the winter. They might sell a little bit, locally, but they're not like sending their crops to a market. The South is a little bit different because their economy is based on cash crops. So a lot of what we're talking about here is the New England area, but we will talk about the South here in a moment. So another thing that marks the world as it was is that if most people are living on farms, what's going on in the cities? Cities and farms were very separated. What I mean by that is, if you look at Houston, right? If you look at our modern kind of living situation, Houston is a big city, and it's very spread out, right? You can start in downtown Houston and start driving. Like, let's say you're driving west towards Katy. You drive for 20 minutes, you're still in the city. When you drive for 30 minutes, you start to hit the suburbs, right? You start to hit Katy, and then, I don't know if there's anything past Katy in terms of suburban area, but you gradually start to get out. I think maybe past Katy, there's like Fulshire, Richmond is kind of like that southwest area. Gradually, though, you finally start to get into that rural space, right? So it's like In our modern day, the cities kind of ebb outwards until finally you're past all the urban landscape and then you finally hit the rural areas. And in our modern day, like, we're very interconnected by roads and infrastructure, and the way that people live. Back then, there was a lack of connectivity between the rural spaces and the cities. There was a big disconnect there. They were often like separate spheres. Things that happened in the city kind of remained in the city, and things that happened in the rural landscapes kind of remained over there. And so there wasn't a lot of interplay between the big cities and the rural land, the rural areas of the country. Partially, this was the result of a lack of infrastructure, right? There just wasn't an easy way to get from a rural space to the city and vice versa. Whereas in our modern day, we have built infrastructure to connect rural spaces and cities together. That sort of stuff didn't exist way back in, as I say, in the world as it was after the American Revolution and kind of in the early Republic. Another thing that denotes the world as it was relates to gender and gender roles in American society. American society was very patriarchal, meaning men ran almost everything. Women didn't have any voting rights, women had very few legal rights, and women were largely confined to the home. Especially in wealthy and middle-class families, women were largely confined to being housewives. Now, if a woman was in a rural kind of farming family, she oftentimes would work and had a very critical role in the survival of that family. So there is a difference between, the farming communities and the cities, but in particular, there's a class difference here. Wealthy families could afford to have women stay at home and not work. Working class families often could not. Another thing that marks the world as it was is the idea of time. So everybody knew time, and what I mean by that is the 24 hours of the day and the cycle of the hours and how minutes worked and like the whole thing. Like, people knew about that, obviously. They knew how to tell time. But time for the farming communities was a lot more general. Farmers didn't set an alarm and wake up, to be at a job in a factory. They just woke up when the rooster crowed or when the sun started peeking through their windows. Their life was much more, their schedule was beholden to the seasons and the sun than it was to the wage hourly labor that we think of today. So for farming communities, time was like a general concept. You didn't really have to pay attention to what the time was because it didn't really affect you that much. That is going to change radically over the course of this lecture. We are going to see how in the beginning, farming communities really, like I said, they worried about the seasons and the sun and the weather, didn't really care about, the specificities of time, whereas at the end of this lecture, they're very much going to care about those things. Another thing that marks the world as it was, this early Republic era that we're talking about here, is the wide availability of land made wage labor unpopular. And when I say wage labor, I mean working for a boss, getting paid for your labor hourly, which is largely I have a sneeze. Goodness. Which is largely the basis of our economy today, right? Wage labor is like the foundation of the capitalist system in a lot of ways. But back in this time period in the early Republic, land was widely available, and thank you. And I was saying thank you for the blesses in the chat. I appreciate that. What I mean by available land is that there was land in the West, right? Native American land that the Native Americans had been living on for generations. But Americans looked at that as land that was theirs to expand into, right? And so Americans looked west and saw all this available land. And as a result, they're going to say, I would rather live on a farm out west rather than working in a factory, for a boss. So the availability of land and the idea of westward expansion makes wage labor seem unappealing. People would rather live on a farm and have their own lifestyle, be their own bosses, than work a wage labor position. For people like that, if you talked about the market, that would relate to people who worked in banking or industry or traders or merchants. Regular farmers didn't think about the marketplace. That wasn't really something that concerned them. Again, that is all something that's going to change over the course of this lecture. So I'm trying to fix my camera here. It's driving me nuts. There we go. Okay, so Charles Sellers is a historian. Let me get his quote up here. He's like one of those like all-star historians, right? The kind of historian that he's the kind of guy that like every historian wants to write the book that like changes the whole field, right? And Charles Sellers wrote a book called The Market Revolution. And in this book, he kind of details a lot of what we're talking about today and how the market revolution affected American society. And this is what he wrote. This, I think, is a great definition, an academic definition of the market revolution. And he says, while dissolving deeply rooted patterns of behavior and belief for competitive effort, it, meaning the market revolution mobilized collective resources through government to fuel growth in countless ways, not least by providing the essential legal, financial, and transport infrastructures. So to stop right there, he's basically saying the market revolution changes the way, like these patterns of behavior and competition, and it is going to encourage growth by creating this infrastructure, whether that's legal infrastructure or financial infrastructure or transport. Continuing forward, he said, establishing capitalist hegemony over economy, politics, and culture, the market revolution created ourselves and most of the world that we know. And so hegemony means power, authority over something. And during this lecture, we're going to see how capitalism becomes the dominant political or economic philosophy in the United States, and it is going to deeply affect the economy, the politics, and the culture of the United States. And Charles Sellers argues that we in the modern day still feel the effects of this. Like the economy that we have today is still based upon the changes that happened during this time period, which is so interesting because, this is the 18 teens and the 1820s, and most people, would think like, oh, everything was so different back then. But in many ways, some things are still the same. So in order to talk about the market revolution, the first place we have to begin is actually in the South, which sounds weird because most of the time people consider the South to be this backwards place. There's virtually no industry. There's still lots of slavery. And so it seems like an odd place to begin by talking about a revolution in the economy. But the reason why we're starting in the South is because of the rise of the Cotton Kingdom. So there had been this increase in textile manufacturing in Europe. Textiles meaning clothing. Europe had become this hotbed for creating or manufacturing textiles. And in fact, that is going to come to the New England area too. Massachusetts will soon be the epicenter of manufacturing in the United States, and mostly it'll be making clothes. And in 1794, this invention comes out called the cotton gin. Now, let me tell you why the cotton gin is important before I tell you what it does. That sounds weird, but I promise it'll make sense. So cotton is a crop that is difficult to harvest. If you've ever held raw cotton, and what I mean by raw cotton, I don't mean like the cotton balls that you can buy in the bags at the store. When I say raw cotton, what I mean is like pulling it off of the plant raw, in the fields. If you've ever actually held raw cotton, you would immediately notice a couple of things. One is that it's like dirty, right? It's not bright white. It hasn't been bleached. But the other thing that you'll undoubtedly notice is that it's coarse. Cotton is a lot coarser than it is after it's been refined. And the last thing you'll notice, which is the most uncomfortable part of it, is that there's seeds inside of it. So cotton grows in these little bulbs, and there's seeds in the middle of the bulb. And those seeds are incredibly difficult to get out. They're very sticky and prickly, and they can prick your fingers and actually make you bleed. They're very sharp. And if you want to pull them out, you actually have to get your hand in there and actually pull it out. And it's incredibly painstaking to do this by hand. So no one really grew cotton back in the day, before the invention of the cotton gin, because growing cotton was seen as very inefficient. If you were a person who grew cotton, you had to. Most people who grew cotton used slave labor to pick the seeds out of the cotton by hand. And you can imagine how this is a process that would take hours, and it's so inefficient. And so really nobody grew cotton. And then the cotton gin comes out. And what the cotton gin did was made it easier to remove the seeds from the actual cotton fibers. The way it worked was you have this contraption here, and you would basically just load the raw cotton in there, seeds and all. You just throw it all in there, and then you turn this crank, and what it does is it runs the cotton fibers through this like wheel thing here that has all these like little teeth in it. And as you turn it, it basically separates the fibers from the seeds, and the seeds fall down into a container. And most of the people who were doing this labor were enslaved people. The soil in the Deep South was critical for this. The Deep South, places like Mississippi, Alabama, even Texas, were hotbeds for growing cotton because the soil and the climate was really good for cotton growing. Cotton, the invention of the cotton gin is so important because it made cotton farming efficient. Before, cotton farming was seen as one of these things that wasn't going to make you a lot of money. It was a fool's errand. But after the invention of the cotton gin, everybody is going to start shifting to growing cotton. Tobacco's out. Tobacco had already been declining at this point, and now people are switching to cotton. I can show you with numbers. These numbers always blow me away. Every time I look at them, this industry basically goes from being nothing to just exploding in a matter of like 50 years. So check this out. 1791, right? There's only 889 bales of cotton being produced in the entire United States. That's virtually none. If you're familiar with the term bale, if you ever have been driving down the highway and see those big hay stacks that are like rounded up like a sausage, they're like in a circle. That's essentially what a bale of cotton looks like, except it's just cotton and not hay. And so that only 889 of those produced in the year 1791. So the cotton industry is basically non-existent. But just 1 year after the cotton gin comes out, now we're up to 28,000 bales of cotton. By 1801, 92,000 bales of cotton. By 1820, 500,000 bales of cotton. Think about that. It was invented in 1794. So a quarter century later, 25 years later, you go from basically a non-existent industry to 500,000 bales of cotton. Just an insane amount of growth. By 1860, which is the eve of the Civil War, there are 5.7 million bales of cotton being grown in the United States, which is just an unfathomable amount of cotton. In fact, by 1860, the U.S. is producing 2/3 of the world's cotton supply. They're selling it everywhere. They're selling it to England. They're selling it to other European countries who make textiles. They're selling it up into Massachusetts to the textile manufacturers up in the north. And so that's one of the things that I think people often get wrong about American society, is that they look at the north as entirely free and the south as entirely full of slave culture, right? Of the culture of the enslavers. And yet, there was an economic interplay there, right? The North used the cotton that was grown and harvested by slave labor. So they weren't, it's not like they had nothing to do with the industry of slavery. In fact, they made money off of it. But the growth of the cotton industry irreversibly changes American history, because what happens is it literally resuscitates the industry of slavery. Slavery was not dying out, but there were people like including people like Thomas Jefferson, who believed that slavery over time would just kind of ebb away. It would eventually just not exist anymore. And the reason why they believed that was because over time the tobacco industry had kind of declined. I think the number of slaves that were being purchased had either plateaued or had declined. And so people looked at these trends and were like, over time, slavery is probably just not going to be a thing anymore. It'll probably just slowly go away. And the cotton industry literally just put it into overdrive. After the cotton gin is invented, more and more enslaved people are being imported to the United States. And then after 1808, when the international slave trade is banned in the U.S., what you start to see is the growth of a domestic slave trade. And so all these slaves that used to live right here in this Chesapeake region, in those like that tobacco growing region of those early colonies, right? Those folks either move or sell their enslaved people down into the Deep South. And so what starts happening is, and that's what that was a picture of, is these are enslaved people being forced to migrate, oftentimes in chains, down through the Deep South until they eventually landed in a place like Mississippi or Louisiana. And so literally like the hotbed of slavery shifts from like this Virginia, North Carolina area down into this like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana area. And to be clear, there's more than just cotton being grown in this region. This region, right, this river right here, the Mississippi, if you actually go to New Orleans today, you can actually still see this. If you go to New Orleans right here and kind of take this road called the River Road, which runs along the Mississippi River up this way, you will see sugar plantation after sugar plantation after sugar plantation just lining the river. And that's because sugar grew really well. The Mississippi River would flood very frequently back in the day, and so they would use those floods to grow sugar. But outside of this region, outside of this Mississippi area, Mississippi in this area, and Alabama over here in Georgia, this is cotton growing land. And so all of these enslaved peoples are being forced to migrate down into this Deep South region. And so slavery itself transports from this Old South right here to like this Deep South down here. And so slavery spreads westward as a result of the cotton gin. Rather than slavery kind of declining and slowly ebbing out of existence, instead what happens is a revitalization of the slave industry, or the enslaving industry. Okay, so we'll talk more about that, because the revitalization of slavery and the growth of the industry of slavery is going to have far-reaching effects in American history. Because if people thought that slavery was dying out over time, then the Civil War was not even a thought in people's minds. But over time, what's going to happen is that the South becomes incredibly wedded to the idea of slavery. It becomes the critical component of the South's economy, whereas the North, over time, is going to gradually move away from slavery. It's not immediate. There are only a handful of states that immediately abolish slavery. I think Massachusetts was one of them. Most northern states abolish slavery gradually. They elect to do a gradual system where over time enslaved people would like age out of slavery. So if you were like an 18-year-old male enslaved person in like Connecticut, you would get your freedom by the age of like 35 or something, right? So you would age out of it. So it was not exactly a forced immediate emancipation. We'll talk a lot more about the institution of slavery, though, and the growth of it and how it affected the country in future lectures. But this is an important starting point here, witnessing the growth of it as a result of the cotton industry. So let's talk about transportation. Now we're shifting kind of to the north here to talk about transportation and how it affects not just the geography of the country, but how people interacted with each other and how and the economy of this region as well. So remember at the beginning of the lecture, we talked about how the cities and the rural areas were kind of disconnected because there wasn't anything connecting them. There was really just dirt roads, and it took a while to get from one place to another. I can give you an example of this. If you're familiar with the layout of Houston, if you go up 290, right? If you go up 290 and you go up to the northwest area of Houston, you kind of have to pass through small suburban areas. Like you first hit Jersey Village, and then you hit like Cypress, and then eventually you'll make your way out there to an exurb called Hockley. So Hockley is originally a very small town that was kind of like an outlier of Houston. Back in the day, I'm talking like before roads, before cars, before trains, if you wanted to get from Hockley to Houston, you had to take a horse, like a horse-drawn carriage. And it would take you a day and a half of full travel, right, and doing nothing but traveling to get from Hockley to Houston. So you're talking 16 to 20 hours of travel just to get from Hockley to Houston, a trip that nowadays takes us 40 minutes, with good traffic, of course. Let's talk about how that transportation revolution gets its start. So in this time period, the outlying rural areas are incredibly disconnected from the cities. And this is a problem because farmers, people who might be living in a place like Hockley, want to get their products where they can sell it, which is a city, right? If farmers are trying to make money off of their crops, they need to be able to sell those crops to people who will buy them. And the people who are going to buy them aren't their neighbors, right? Because they just live around other farmers who are growing the same stuff. They need to be able to sell it to people in the city who aren't farming. But the problem is there's no infrastructure connecting them. So states and local areas start saying, we need to create that infrastructure, right? We need to build a connection system between the cities and like this rural area. And the first type of connection system becomes known as what we know today as toll roads. You know, a toll road is a simple concept, and I'm sure if you've lived in Houston long enough, you've definitely taken one. It's just a road that you pay to use. So a toll road, you know, you would get on the road and, you know, you would bring your horse-drawn carriage and stuff, and it would be usually they weren't paved. Most of the time when people think of roads, they think of like gravel, you know, like asphalt paved roads. Back then they actually used wood, because what they would do is like, think about like a railroad track where you have like the two tracks going, and then they would lay, so the two tracks would be made out of wood, and then they would lay wood planks over that, like slotted right next to each other, so it would be perfectly flat. And they would create a road that way. And these roads allowed, you know, big carriages and you know, horses that were drawing carts to avoid muddy, you know, areas where they might get stuck. And so these roads connected the rural spaces to the cities. So for example, if you lived in a place like Buffalo, New York is right here in far western New York, the state of New York. If you wanted to get from Buffalo to New York City before the invention of roads, you would have to literally walk across this wilderness all the way down here to New York. So instead what they did was they built a toll road that connected Buffalo to Albany. And you may be wondering, why Albany? Well, because there's a river that runs, the Hudson River, comes from the north, goes through Albany and then down to New York City into the harbor and ultimately into the Atlantic Ocean. And so if you were able to get your goods, your crops, whatever you were selling, from Buffalo to Albany, then they could go to New York and onward. And so they started building these toll roads to connect these little local areas. This was very important because these toll roads are the first example of like overland transportation infrastructure in the United States. And this sounds like a really boring topic, but it's actually super, super important, because what it does for humans is it shrinks the world a little bit, right? People in New York probably thought about the people in Buffalo as living like just way the hell out there, right? Like, who lives out there? Like, nobody I know, who cares? But now with the roads connecting these cities, all of a sudden the world becomes just a little bit smaller. Now people can move a little bit further out maybe, and these roads will help them maintain their connection to the cities. You know, they don't feel quite so isolated out in these rural spaces. And it very much physically and economically connects these two places. The economy in Buffalo is now very much tied to the economy in New York City. That connection actually grows stronger with the creation of canals. So this is like the second big revolution in transportation, is the canal system that we start to see develop in the United States. A canal is just a man-made river that connects two bodies of water together. So in this case, you're looking at the connection between Lake Erie right here in the far western part of New York State. Buffalo, it sits right on the edge of Lake Erie. And this canal goes all the way from Buffalo, all the way through Lockport and all these other little small towns until it finally connects over here near Albany. And again, then you can just, what you would do if you were a farmer is you would pay the fare. Someone would take your goods on a boat and ferry them all the way over here to Albany, and then they would ultimately hook up with this Hudson River, and then they would go down to New York City. This is even more efficient than using the toll road. A toll road could be slow, it could be very dependent on the weather, whereas the canal is much faster, especially once they invent steam engines, like this guy right here, the steamboat, invented by Robert Fulton. A guy named Robert Fulton invents the steam engine. You'll read a little bit more about him in the upcoming discussion pamphlet. But Robert Fulton invents the steam engine, and which is able to go against the current of a river. It's able to go faster down these rivers. It's able to pull or haul a little bit more material than, like a rowboat would. And so what is happening here is these farther outlying western areas are increasingly connected to the economies of these bigger cities like Albany and New York. And that increasing connectivity is going to have an effect. The Erie Canal is one of the first like major infrastructure projects in the United States, and of course there will be tons more after this. But I mean, this was a big project. The canal itself is like 350 miles long. It's 40 feet wide. It's only about 4 feet deep. Most boats didn't sit very heavy, so it's only 4 feet deep. It's not that deep. And the way it worked was that on parts of the canal, if your ship was not steam powered, they had teams of horses that would like drag your boat down the canal. Most importantly, though, perhaps I think for the purposes of this lecture, like the idea of like a revolution in the economy, is that so if you're connecting Buffalo to New York, what you're also doing is people from New York could come to Buffalo and even move further west. You can use these Great Lakes here to get even further west, to connect all the way out to Chicago. So now the economies of Chicago are connected to New York through Buffalo, right? So what you're doing is you're interconnecting all these big cities throughout the nation. And what begins to happen here is, first of all, New York becomes an economic powerhouse because it is a central connection point to all of these other economies. And there's this decline in northeastern agriculture, right? A lot of these guys up in like Massachusetts and Vermont and whatnot stopped growing crops because it's just easier to purchase Western grown foods, right? Rather than being farmers themselves, they realize it's easier to specialize in one crop. So let me rephrase, because I think that was a little confusing. So if you're a subsistence farmer, you might grow a whole bunch of different crops because you're trying to feed your family over the long year and through the winter. So you want to have a lot of different things that you can grow to kind of help your family out, right? But now that these markets are all interconnected, you're not as reliant on only what you can grow, right? You can buy stuff from other places. So what farmers start to do is they start to specialize. They will specialize and grow just one thing, right? So out here in this western New York area or in this western Pennsylvania area, people will start growing, all they'll grow is wheat, for example. In Pennsylvania, this was especially true. They would just grow wheat. That's all they would specialize in. And sure, they would save some to make bread for their family, but they would also sell large amounts of their wheat because all they had to do was just load it on a boat. If you're in Olean, New York, all you do is just load your wheat on a boat, ship it up to Rochester, and boom, it's off and running, and you don't even have to see it again. You get paid, and then you can just use the money that you've made to buy other food. It was actually cheaper to buy other food than it was to really grow your own. So the Great Lakes, New York, become this hub of economic commerce. You're seeing these rural spaces get tied closer and closer together to the big cities. Whereas in previous generations, the cities and the rural spaces were kind of separated. They didn't really have a lot of interaction. And people now have a reason to start populating this like Great Lakes region because it's such an economic hotspot. Westward expansion, always happening. The last thing we're going to talk about today regarding infrastructure is railroads. Now, during this era, railroads are only starting to get built. It's really after the Civil War that we see like the explosion of the rail industry and crossing the country and all this kind of stuff. But even as far as 1840, you can start to see elements of the railroad infrastructure being built. It's mostly along the coastline here, right? You can see it right here, kind of centered around like the capital, up through Baltimore and New Jersey, and then of course New York, gets up here and into Massachusetts, into Boston. But it's not super widespread. It takes a long time for the railroad industry to really get off the ground because it requires a lot of innovation and it requires a lot of money. When I say it requires a lot of innovation, so for example, in 1804, that was the first time someone created a steam engine for propelling like land vehicles. The first circular track for locomotives happened in 1820. You don't need to know these years or anything. Then the first commercial rail line didn't open until 1825. And so by the time you get to 1840, which is the map you're looking at right here, there's only about 3,000 miles of railroad in the United States. There is some in the South, right? You can see a little bit like kind of snaking down here through North Carolina and South Carolina, and then some into Georgia. There's none. There's only this little track in South Carolina. The Deep South doesn't have no railroads. But by 1860, you go from 3,000 miles of railroad to 27,000 miles of railroad. So there's just like this massive increase in just a span of about 20 years. But it cost the federal government tons of money to do this. The federal government is largely responsible for the creation and construction of these big rail lines. What these are going to do, though, Chicago is not connected to a rail line by 1840, but it soon will be. So Chicago is going to become this very central point for westward expansion, because it's connected via the Great Lakes right here. Like if you want to get to Chicago using the canal system, you would go up the Hudson River, over to Buffalo, and then through Lake Erie and the rest of these lakes until you finally land on Chicago. It takes a while, but you'd get there. What's crazy, though, is that this canal system would take like 2 to 3 weeks to get all the way from Buffalo to Chicago. But once the railroads get built, to get from Chicago to New York takes 2 days. So railroads really, really start to shrink the country. When the railroads start getting built, it becomes so much easier and faster to connect, to kind of stitch the country together. It's one reason why, and railroads become a symbol of American innovation and become a symbol of westward expansion. It's a reason why if you watch any old school like Western movies, like with cowboys and whatnot, you'll almost always see trains and railroads in those movies, and it's because it's a symbol of the West. And it's also just how people moved around back in those days. Little towns would kind of like crop up around the railroad stops because that's just where people were. Most importantly, though, is what I mentioned earlier, is that we're going to see this increased connectivity. People are going to start specializing in the crops that they grow. And rather than growing food only for their family, now they're selling it. And so this kind of gets at the heart of what we're talking about today, which is the idea of like a marketplace, right? This market revolution. Rather than just growing crops for their family, rather than just growing crops for survival, these farmers are now growing crops for the market, right? They're growing crops to sell, right? So there's a profit motive. It's no longer just about survivability and sustainability. It's about profit. It's about making money. And it's about, and this changes the way people view the economy. Because prior to this, the only people who really like worked in like a market economy were like traders, merchants, people who lived in cities. But now you've got even farmers kind of getting into this integrated market economy that's starting to stretch away across the entire United States. Now, there's a key aspect of this that we haven't touched on, and that's land. Because if you're going to move out into this western territory, you got to have land. And so the government is going to play a key role in this. The government is going to sell land for incredibly cheap to settlers to move out into the West. Now, again, it always bears mentioning that when you're talking about selling land in this area right here, like this Indiana territory, Illinois territory, this Wisconsin area right here, you're talking about displacing Native Americans, right? This is not just free land that's open for the taking, that no one's living there. There are, of course, people living there. But after the War of 1812, a lot of the Native American groups in this region have been kind of shoved to the side. They've been shoved past the Mississippi River, and it opens up this area for the expansion of Americans. And so you would have people buying land, like snatching up land out here, buying it, by the acre, just tons of it, because they're speculating, right? They're hoping that the price of that land will go up and they can sell it later and make money. You also had people who would move out there and just live off the land and not ever try to pay for it, right? People that started to be known as squatters, that they would just move out there and basically like not tell anybody and just try to live off the land for free. And so the West is going to emerge as a very powerful region in the United States. And there are people who would argue that westward expansion is like one of the things that really makes the United States what it is, even today. Because you had people in the early part of American history, right? You had that proclamation line of 1763 after the 7 Years' War. Everybody was kind of shoved up on the coastline right here, and the King of England was like, "Hey, don't go past this line." Well, now Americans are very far past that line, to the point where Ohio is a state in 1803. Indiana will be a state pretty soon after. Kentucky and Tennessee were made states in the 1790s. And now people are starting to look even past the Mississippi River, and they're like, hey, what's this territory out here, right? When can we start moving even further west? This treaty that you're looking at, this map that you're looking at on your screen right here, is the Adams-Onis Treaty. And the Adams-Onis Treaty was actually signed in 1819, and it is a treaty between Spain and the United States. And the reason why I'm showing it to you is because there's two changes that are important that I think bear mentioning. One is that the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819 allowed the United States to buy Florida. So Spain, for a lot of different reasons, is kind of getting out of the colonial game in North America. They had just recently been defeated by, this is still called the Viceroyalty of New Spain, but pretty soon they're going to lose the revolution to the Mexican revolutionaries, and they're going to start wanting to get out of the colonial game in North America. They decide to sell Florida to the United States. The United States is more than happy to buy it, especially many of these Southerners who lived right here who didn't like the fact that many slaves were escaping south into Florida. Now that's no longer an option. The other thing the Adams-Onis Treaty does that's important is it more clearly defines this Louisiana Purchase territory. When America first bought, when America first bought the Louisiana Territory, if you see this like kind of dotted hashed line right here, it's very nebulous, right? It's very kind of like, it almost looks like someone just was like, yeah, it looks good, this is like draw whatever. But the Adams-Onis Treaty actually like clearly defined what the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase were, rather than it being kind of this like nebulous like squiggly line. They used lines of latitude. They're like, all right, right here, 49 north, that's the upper boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. This line right here is the other boundary, and you can start to see they use the rivers right here and right here to define and tighten up the region of the Louisiana Purchase. Notably, of course, you start to see the outline of Texas come out. All of us who live in Texas and very much know what Texas, the outline of Texas looks like, and you can start to see it with like the Red River and the Sabine River there. Notably, Texas is not part of this treaty, but there were already American politicians, people like Henry Clay and even Andrew Jackson, that believed that Texas was destined to be a part of the United States. And there were people who actually encouraged and wanted the Adams-Onis Treaty to include Texas. So there are already people in the United States with their eyes on Texas, even though at this point Texas was very, very sparsely populated. There was very few people living in Texas. In fact, most of Texas was really controlled by Native Americans at this point in time in 1819. In 1819, like the Comanche dominated this area, right? Like these maps make things look so much more organized than the reality. The reality was back then there was a fierce group of Native American, two of them, that dominated this whole area right here. The Comanche, the Cheyenne, and the Kiowa were all in this region right here, just horse warriors that just dominated the Great Plains. And then the Apache were like down here in this region. And the Spanish and then Mexican government had a hell of a time fighting these groups. And so this whole region of Texas, the only place people really lived in Texas was in El Paso over here, a little bit along the border, and like a few settlements like right over here along the coastline. Like San Antonio was a small city at this point, and you had a couple settlements over here. But by and large, Texas was not very well populated. All right, let's talk about the early Industrial Revolution. So to begin, I think it's important to talk about how people first started working in industry and then what it is going to evolve into. So early industrial jobs actually occurred mostly at home. There was this economic system that became known as the putting out system. And how it worked was you would do most of the work at home. Like let's say that you were a cobbler, somebody who made or mended shoes, or you worked in the textile industry and you made shirts. You would work out of your home and do a lot of your work at home and then take it to a factory to kind of do the finishing touches, whether that was like the buttons or some of like the, say you needed a machine to help you do some of the finer points of shirt making. But you would do most of your work at home and then take it to a factory. But eventually it will evolve into a system where all of the work is being done at the factory. And that has a radical change on the way Americans live their lives, because now a person's life is centered around their job, right? They don't get to set their own hours anymore. They don't get to wake up whenever they want anymore. Now they have to show up at a certain time on the dot. Otherwise, you're going to get fired. You have a boss. You're getting paid a wage rather than kind of being able to sell your own goods. So what happens in this early industrial revolution is increasingly industries and people are specializing and standardizing the processes. During the putting out system, a tailor, someone who makes clothing, every tailor might have a different technique for doing something. Under the factory system, though, it's all automated. Everything, or at least standardized, everything is done in the same way every time. And that's because it makes the process more efficient. And if something is more efficient, that means you can usually make more money doing it. And that brings us to another part of the early industrial revolution, is the idea of a profit motive. In the early days of the American economy, much of the economy was like the barter system. Like, you still had money, of course, but people would just make stuff to sell. They would barter stuff. When the Industrial Revolution gets here, everything changes and it becomes very profit oriented. Like, you are trying to make stuff and make money off of the things that you create. And rather than building stuff yourself, like let's say you needed a couple of chairs. In the early days, people would just build the chairs themselves. In the Industrial Revolution era and beyond, people don't build their own chairs, right? Like most of us aren't at home with our workshop equipment, like building a chair. We just go to a store and buy one. This early Industrial Revolution is going to change the way Americans view work. It's going to change the way people view purchasing items, or the economy in general. It's going to change the way people live, gender roles in American society. So the Industrial Revolution starts in New England, really in Massachusetts. And the reason why it starts up there and the reason why the Industrial Revolution happens is partially because of inventions. In the early days of American history, inventions weren't profitable. It was not profitable to be an inventor because you couldn't make money on it until laws changed that allowed you to patent your inventions. That's what, if you remember back to the very beginning of this lecture, when I shared that quote by Charles Sellers, and he said that there was this legal infrastructure that was created. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about, is that the American government created laws that made it profitable for people to make money on inventions. So you could patent an invention, something you created, and then sell that invention to other people. So, for example, Eli Whitney is the guy who invented the cotton gin, and he would try to make money off of that cotton gin by patenting it. He also created the idea of interchangeable parts, and again, would try to make money off of that idea. A guy named, you don't need to know all these guys, but like a guy named Cyrus McCormick created a thing called the wheat thresher. John Deere, the guy who starts the Deere company, the John Deere company, creates the steel plow. Samuel Slater creates the first U.S. factory in Massachusetts in 1790. So all these guys started inventing because it's now profitable to do so. Probably the best example, I think, of this early industrial revolution is the factory system that existed in Lowell, Massachusetts, often just known as the Lowell factories. So Lowell was Lowell was named after a man who, that was his last name, and his first name escapes me for the moment, but Lowell created this factory system in Massachusetts, and the town became named after him and his factories. And Lowell's factories were different than that early putting out system, because what his factories did was every phase of production happened in the factory. So what I mean by that is his factories were making textiles, so like jackets, shirts, pants, whatever, clothing. And the base materials for these things are wool, cotton, thread, right? So you start off with the base materials, right? Like the cotton and the wool. And then over the course of time in the factory, you go from raw cotton to fabric to, the various production processes to making a shirt. Clearly I know a lot about this process. But you go from having like raw materials to, at the end of the process, having a shirt, something that people can buy. And every phase of that process takes place in the factory. This is I don't think Lowell was the first one to do this, but he was an early adopter of it. And this revolutionized the industrial game, because now people are, you no longer are working out of your house, right? All of your work is done at the factory. This is a radical change for a lot of people's lifestyles. Most people were used to working out of their home and occasionally maybe going to a factory to kind of do some work and maybe earn a paycheck. But now people's entire livelihood is based on going to work, right? Waking up at 8 to be at work at 9 and then being done at 5. Although back then they worked much longer hours because there were no laws about limitations on how much people could be forced to work. One of the things that set the Lowell factory apart, though, was who worked there. In an effort to save money on overhead, which means employers or employees paying your workers, in order to save money on that, Lowell hired the lowest paying people that he could think of, which was young women. So farming was kind of dying out in New England, meaning like a lot of farming families were struggling. They needed extra income because they were struggling to make money on especially like family farming. And so often young women would be kind of pushed into industrial labor. And in this case, many of them went and worked for the Lowell system. So the way it worked was that they would literally leave their family and go live and work at the Lowell factory. Lowell himself, if you're looking at these two buildings here, one of them is the actual factory itself, and the other one is the dormitory that housed all of the women who worked in the factory. And he paid for all of that. He paid for the dorm. He fed the workers. He had supervisors who lived in that dorm with them. He kept the dorms clean. And at first, this was actually a pretty good system because Lowell offered pretty competitive wages. At the time, it was relatively generous. However, this was still a difficult transition for most of the women who worked there. You got to remember that a lot of these women are coming from rural spaces, right? They've lived in rural America for years and have no experience living in cities, no experience living around hundreds of other people. And yet now they're all kind of being thrust together in this like one environment. And especially over time, this becomes a problem because their lives are very regimented, like their lives are dominated by the clock, right? By time. What time are you off? What time do you start? How many hours have you worked this week? They're also surrounded by strangers. And particularly by the 1830s, as more and more of these textile mills crop up in Massachusetts, the market for textiles becomes incredibly competitive, and Lowell starts losing money because there's more competition, and he doesn't want to lose money, right? He wants to keep profits high. So what he starts doing is he starts not paying his workers as much. He starts giving them poorer quality food. He starts not paying as much care about the living conditions in the dormitory, to the point where there are worker revolts that start happening in his own factories. And we'll talk about, you'll read about some of those in the documents for the upcoming discussion. But so women could be forced to work 14-hour days in these factory conditions, and eventually it's going to lead to like strikes and discontent and anger. But over time, textile mills will turn away from women laborers and eventually turn to immigrant laborers for the same reason: low pay. We'll talk about that later. Okay. One thing I wanted to talk about in regards to the market revolution is how the economy is growing and how that affected the way people live their lives. So economic growth increased average income over time. So by and large, people are doing better than previous generations. But that economic growth was unequal. The people who really benefited were the wealthy Americans. Industrialists, people who owned factories, right? High-level merchants, bankers, accumulated vast fortunes during this market revolution. They grew so wealthy, they start throwing these like lavish parties and looked for ways to kind of like show off or flaunt their wealth. They had these social clubs that only like wealthy people could go to. They owned these big mansions in New York City. New York City, of course, had like being the kind of center of American commerce, had this really elaborate high society. In fact, there's an interesting story about Central Park. If you've ever been to New York or just know anything about it, Central Park is this lovely, huge park right in the middle of the city. It's wonderful. You go there and you can see street performers. You can get like ice cream. Like it's huge and easily walkable, and it's really pretty and well kept. But back when it was created, the reason why Central Park was created was so the wealthy could actually like ride their carriages around. They wanted a place where they could have a nice place to kind of ride their carriages around. They didn't want to ride them in the streets where all the riffraff was. They wanted to like ride them in this nice park area, which I think is kind of funny. So that's what the wealthy were doing. The wealthy are benefiting the most from the market revolution. The people who benefit the least from it are the urban poor. Poor people are benefiting the least from this market revolution. And when I say poor people, there are a lot of different types of people or lifestyles that, or groups that exist under that category. So we're talking about landless farmers, right? People who don't own land and have to pay either rent or work on land to make money. We're talking about Native Americans. We're talking about unskilled laborers who, again, have to work for a living, usually doing menial jobs. We're obviously talking about enslaved people, who are almost in like a category in and of themselves in terms of poverty and the treacherous life that they were forced to live in. The poor, obviously slaves did not get paid, but even people who did have these jobs that in this new industrial system hardly had any share of the large economic growth. So even though the average goes up, it's really the wealthy kind of pulling that average up because most people didn't benefit all that much. Poverty could sometimes be the result of prejudice. So sometimes people were impoverished not because they weren't hard workers, but just because they were heavily discriminated against. Good examples include the Irish. Irish people in the North were often viewed as vulgar, drunks. Because they were Catholic, they were viewed as kind of an alien group in a way. Anti-Catholicism has a long history in the United States. And as a result, they were only ever afforded the most menial jobs in Northern society. In a similar way, free blacks in the North also had a similar experience. They suffered the worst, in fact, because even if some of some of the black people in the North had been free for generations, but they had no political rights, they couldn't vote, they couldn't attend public school, they couldn't use public services, so all of the things that even the Irish could take advantage of were prohibited to free blacks. But life in the North was still preferable for free blacks than it was in the South. Frederick Douglass will write about this in his book. He escapes slavery and moves to the North and takes a job as like working on the docks as a free black laborer. And even though he is heavily discriminated against, and sometimes gets into fights with his coworkers because they're so racist towards him, he still acknowledges that life is better in the North than it ever was or would have been in the South. The most interesting group, perhaps, when it comes to the kind of the patterns of society is the middle class. And we'll talk about the cult of domesticity here in just a moment. The middle class was the not the largest, but the fastest growing group in the United States. The middle class is situated right in between, of course, the upper class and the lower class. Lower class being the largest group in the United States. But the middle class is starting to make themselves known. They are able to buy houses. Now, they're not as large as the mansions that the wealthy can afford, but they're able to afford houses. They're able to own houses that have that have multiple rooms. Now, that might seem silly, but the idea of owning multiple rooms or having a place where you could have privacy was, allergies, used to be the purview only of the wealthy. And so there's a little bit of social mobility happening during this market revolution. The problem is, of course, that this social mobility was limited to a very few amount of people, right? Most people did not have access to this social mobility. But so the middle class is able to start affording houses, starting to able to afford the things that other previous generations might not have had access to. So let's talk about the cult of domesticity. One of the things that you may have noticed over the course of this lecture is that there's this growing separation between the home and the workplace, right? You have, over the course of this market revolution, people at first were working at home and living in their kind of home space. And then at the end of this market revolution, they're going to work, right? They're leaving their house and going to work. And what that does is it creates a distinction between home and workplace. And because women are often kept at home, it creates a separate gender distinction between men and women. So, this is especially true for the middle and upper class. For the lower classes, this is like what we're talking about here is less true, because lower class women, working class women had to work, right? They had to work, and middle class women did not. Women had fewer political rights still at this moment. They lived under the virtual authority of their husbands. Their husbands controlled almost every aspect of their life. Women were discouraged from getting an education, and in fact, you couldn't even get an education if you were a woman at this point in time. Before 1837, no colleges accepted women at all. So it was impossible to get higher education if you were a woman during this period of time. And there's a shift even for women and the way that they worked and the way that they lived their life, because in the pre-industrial society, in the world as it was at the beginning of this lecture, women played a critical role in the economic survival of their family. If things are done at home, women are playing a role. If work is at home, women are playing a role, especially if it's a farming family. But as the workplace gets extended outward, and as people start taking jobs outside of the home, going to a factory to work, all of a sudden, men are the ones doing that work. Men are the ones who take the job and leave the house and go to work. Women are then kind of asked, or if not forced, to stay at home and be homemakers. And so women become seen as like the guardians of domestic virtue, right? They take care of the children. They take care of the homestead. They make sure that the house is clean, that it's comfortable, that they try to dress stylishly to entertain guests. That's what I mean when I said this is much more like middle and upper class women. And middle class women often try to emulate the styles or mannerisms of upper class women. So what we're talking about here is the emergence of kind of like a feminine sphere. There were women had more leisure time to a certain degree during this era. Middle class women especially, they would read romance novels, or there was romance novels became a thing during this era, or there was the creation of magazines that were solely geared towards women, like fashion magazines start to become popular during this era. And so this whole cult of domesticity placed a higher emphasis on feminine virtues, right? That women needed to be chaste. They needed to be kept at home. Their job was to raise children and be homemakers, to entertain guests when necessary, to basically keep the home a peaceful, pleasant place, because the man was out there doing like the work, right? The man was out there in the doing the rigorous work of factory work, or just participating in the hurly-burly of politics and economics, right? And so the woman's job was to kind of like have this like home space that he could come home to. And so there's like these very divided spheres of what men and women were expected to do and to be in this era. And again, this is middle class and upper class women only. Working class women did not have these luxuries. So let's kind of talk about the birth of American capitalism to kind of cap off this lecture. Over the course of this lecture, we have seen urban and rural markets become interconnected. And what this is going to do is it is going to create a system that is built around a profit motive. Everything becomes bent on making profit. And that's how you get these families that have extravagant wealth during this period of time, because everything is focused around making money rather than just like sustainability or survival or subsistence farming. You have people whose whole careers are built around the idea of making money, either in the factory system or what have you. A lot of that money making comes at the exploitation of labor, which is also kind of an element of capitalism. Capitalism thrives on paying people as little as possible to make the maximum amount of profit. So in a way, this is an early form of the capitalism that we still see today, which is a kind of a divergence of wealth in society, where you have like a handful of very, very wealthy people at the top and a lot of people who don't have wealth at the bottom of society, and a certain amount of exploitation that is permissible because it allows for the creation of profit for wealthy landowners or corporations or whatever. So in this era, we start to see a widening gap between the wealthy and the not wealthy, and that gap never really closes again. We will see that gap when we get to the if you take my class in my 1302, I talk about this again, that in the post-Civil War era, that wealth gap just increases. The only time that wealth gap has closed or got shrunk a little bit was in the 1950s and 60s when taxes on the wealthy were incredibly high. Otherwise, the wealth gap has been huge. It still is. Like, if you actually look at the wealth gap in American society today, it's astronomical. So let's talk about the significance of the market revolution as kind of a way to conclude our lecture for the day. Like, what does it mean? What does all of this mean for us going forward, for the people who are living at this time period? So the whole country is more interconnected, right? That was one of the key things we talked about in the beginning of this lecture, is that you go from a society that was very disconnected to now all of a sudden everything is connected by canals and roads and railroads. And what this is going to do, this connectivity, is not only going to fuel economic growth, but it's also going to fuel westward expansion. People are going to start pushing west in greater numbers because it's easier to get out there. And hey, if you're more connected to the inner city or to the big cities back east, then there's no problem with moving west. Moving west seems to be safer now that there's more kind of quote unquote civilization moving out there along with you. And the growth of the interconnection or the interconnectivity of the United States also is going to fuel economic expansion, right? More, like, the economy transitions from that pre-industrial era to now an industrialized economy. Another key piece of significance of the market revolution is the revival of slavery. People thought that slavery was just going to kind of ebb out of existence. And then with the invention of the cotton gin and kind of the growth of the cotton kingdom, slavery, which some historians have called America's original sin, is going to continue to be a problem. There will be movements that will grow to stop slavery, right? The abolition movement grows in the 1830s and 40s. But then by the same time, Southerners will become increasingly defensive about slavery. They will increasingly try to defend and protect the institution of slavery. That's going to be a huge problem going forward. We will spend numerous lectures talking about how the United States has to deal with slavery and try to solve that problem that's really unsolvable. It's going to take a civil war. One of the other things that I want to talk about in this kind of a thing that changed irreversibly is just how people live their lives. People's lives radically changed during this market revolution. Poor people, people who are working class, now they're no longer living on a farm, they're punching a clock, right? They're showing up to work every day, clocking in and getting paid by the hour rather than making goods out of their homes, or rather than working on a farm. You got the middle class growing. They're upwardly mobile. Wealthy are the people the rich kind of extend their lead on everybody else. But perhaps most importantly for everybody is that society just seems sped up, right? Because now, if remember at the beginning of the lecture, I talked about how time was very general. Like if you were working on a farm, you didn't really have to care about what time it was, but now you do, right? You might need to catch a train. You might need to get your goods to that ship before it leaves to go down the canal, right? So time matters now, and everything seems like it's sped up. Like you got factories who are just churning out shirts and other textiles, and so life goes from this very slow, rustic, rural type of mentality to a sped up, industrialized society. And the problem is that with this focus on profit motive, this idea that everything that we do needs to somehow make money, there are a lot of people who are uncomfortable with that. There's going to be a lot of criticism of all these changes that are taking place in American society. People are going to start thinking, is it healthy to focus solely on making money? And in fact, there are going to be people who argue that the pursuit of profit is going to lead to moral decline or social decline, right? That there are going to be movements that we're going to talk about in the next lecture where people are going to argue, dude, we got to do something to save America's soul. Like we're selling ourselves out here. We're becoming, we're lusting after money rather than a pursuit of enlightenment or a pursuit of God, perhaps. We'll talk about those movements next time. So that's the end of this lecture for the day, guys. Remember, we do have a discussion coming up next week on Thursday. So I hope you guys are looking forward to that. And if you haven't started reading that material, I would go ahead and start. If you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat here for a second. But one thing I wanted to say before I kind of sign off is that if you haven't started reading the Frederick Douglass book, or especially if you haven't purchased it yet, I would go ahead and do that. The Frederick Douglass book is a pretty slim volume. It's only about 100 pages or so, but it's still a book that was written in the 1840s, and it's a great book. And Frederick Douglass himself is just absolutely brilliant. But it's one of those books that if you're not used to reading the language of that era, it might take you a little bit of time to read it. Or if you're just a slower reader, and there's no shame in that, I'm kind of a slow reader myself, but make sure you start reading it a little bit early and give yourself the time to finish it. So thank you guys for being here today. I really appreciate it. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm going to sign off for today. I'll see you guys on Tuesday. We'll talk about the social movements of this time period, the kind of backlash to the market revolution. I'll